So the carbon carrying capacity of an ecosystem, which is the framework I like to think about these forests in for this particular topic, is really a function of the prevailing climate and natural disturbance conditions in an ecosystem. So through the successional process, carbon accumulates in the system to some level. And then when something like a wildfire or other disturbance occurs, if the climatic and natural disturbance conditions that led to the pre-fire condition persist, we can expect a full recovery of that carbon stock with succession. However, if the system experiences altered climate space and or disturbance conditions, the potential exists for post-fire recovery to an alternative vegetation state, such as a shrubland or grassland. It seems like we've got a problem, Stacy, with blank slides.
So it might just be an internet connection. It's coming through fine for me. I see the legacy of fire suppression.
Okay.
Maybe just give it a second. It might be catching up to you.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll just not yet, but I know what's on the slide. I've got my presentation on my computer here, so I can go with it.
Let me ask too, is anybody in the room, let me know in the chat box if you're not able to see the slide. Okay, looks like other people can see it fine, so go ahead.
Okay. So in many dry western forests, surface fire was an integral process for maintaining forest structure, cycling nutrients, and creating a heterogeneous environment that facilitated both species and habitat diversity. In the US, we began an all-out war on forest fires in the early 1900s, which has contributed to our current predicament of larger, hotter wildfires. From a carbon perspective, fire exclusion has really pushed the amount of carbon stored in these systems beyond the carrying capacity as determined by prevailing natural disturbance conditions. As a result, we are seeing large swings in the carbon stored in live tree biomass because of these larger, hotter wildfires, and are killing many more trees than are killed by surface fire. So work by my colleague Leroy Westerling has demonstrated a decadal increase in area burned by large wildfires in the western U.S. However, this outcome is not solely driven by a legacy of fire suppression or fire exclusion. The decadal increase in area burned correlates with increasing temperature, which causes earlier spring snowmelt and a longer fire season. And in the Sierra Nevada, the most recent decade in Leroy's analysis shows a 274% increase in area burned over the 1970s decade, which he used as a baseline. And in the Southwest, about a 462% increase in area burned. So temperature projections for the southwestern U.S. Show a 3 to 5 degree Fahrenheit increase in mean annual temperature by mid-century. But what we really see things heat up when we look at temperature increase by season. Summer temperatures projected to increase by 5 to 6 degrees Fahrenheit by mid-century. This means higher atmospheric water demand and more water stress for trees in these forested ecosystems. And from a fire perspective, it translates into a drying out of the ecosystem, leading to increased flammability. So precipitation projections for mid-century indicate drier spring and summer seasons, which will also add to ecosystem water stress and increase the flammability of these ecosystems. So from a climate change mitigation perspective, policymakers are interested in understanding how restoring forest structure by thinning forests and reintroducing surface fire really alters the carbon balance of the system and reduces the risk of high severity wildfire. These questions are also integral to understanding the prevailing natural disturbance aspect of the carbon carrying capacity idea. Yet disturbance is only part of that carrying capacity concept, and thinking about the interaction of climate and disturbance is essential if we want to understand how these factors will influence species distributions and carbon dynamics in forests going forward. So the carbon carrying capacity questions that my group's been working on in the past few years and what I plan to talk about today include one, what are the impacts of forest restoration on carbon dynamics? And then, or I'm sorry, the restoration with carbon dynamics in looking at climate and wildfire, and then also just the climate and wildfire effects on carbon distributions across large landscapes. And so for the research I'll be talking about today, we used the LANDIS-II landscape forest succession and disturbance model. When we develop a simulation landscape, we use forest inventory data, and we use soil data and a number of other data sources to best represent that landscape given current conditions. In this research, in addition to the core LANDIS-II model, we're also using the century succession extension, which allows us to simulate fluxes of carbon and nitrogen, and we use the dynamic fire and fuels extension to simulate wildfire. So we've been investigating the potential for changing climate and increasing area burn to alter both the distribution of species and carbon dynamics across the entire Sierra Nevada. For this particular study, we used 3 climate model projections forced by a moderate high emission scenario and their associated area burn projections from Leroy Westerling's work. So when we look at the distribution of dominant species by biomass under projected climate and wildfire as compared to historical climate and wildfire, we found relatively small changes in dominant species. The primary change was reduced above ground carbon, which you can see in this red box. It's the little dots with the whiskers on it under projected climate and wildfire, and that's only at low and mid elevations. But when what we did find was really that all the action across the mountain range under these different projections was in tree regeneration. So under projected climate and wildfire, there were substantial reductions in the number of recruitment events across climate scenarios. And the species that accounted for the majority of recruitment events changed under projected climate and wildfire, with the majority of regeneration being comprised of species that are more drought tolerant, as you see in the figure on the lower right. So a big increase in particularly pines such as gray pine at the lowest elevation and ponderosa and Jeffrey pines at the mid elevation. So these reduced recruitment events led to substantial decreases in species richness across the mountain range by the end of our simulations, which is year 2100. This outcome is in large part driven by a mismatch between the location of reproductive individuals and the climate space that's conducive to their establishment. So at this point, we hypothesized that the reason we didn't see a response in biomass by dominant species is because trees are relatively long-lived, and really even under projected climate and wildfire scenarios, fire remains relatively rare on the landscape. And this work, this study suggested that the catalyst for change, in this case fire, isn't happening with a high enough frequency to drive changes across the entire study area, given the projected climate. So we decided to run another simulation experiment where we simulated the projected climate scenarios through 2099, and then we assumed stabilization of the climate space at late 21st century climate conditions for several centuries. And so because these simulations are pretty computationally intensive, we ran them across 3 transects that covered the northern, middle, and southern Sierra, and that's represented by the 3 boxes you see on that map. And on the right, we show snowline elevation for each of the 3 transects through late 21st century. And functionally, what's going on here is that snowline increases by about 200 meters in elevation under projected climate by the year 2100. So for the remainder of the simulation period, you've got snowpack providing growing season moisture for a lot smaller fraction of the land area of each of those transects. So by the end of our simulations, we found a substantial reduction in total ecosystem carbon as compared to total carbon under historical climate and wildfire. So these box plots show the north, middle, and south transects under projected climate, which are the colored boxes, and then the black ones are the same simulation period run under historical climate, 1980 to 2010, just drawing from that climate distribution and historical fire size distributions. So the mismatch in climate space between seed sources and climate suitable for regeneration led to a decrease in the proportion of the land area that's forested by the end of the simulations. So we've basically got median values under historical climate and wildfire, which are the black box plots at the top, around 100% forested area, and then median values in the middle, in the north, middle, and south transects between 40 and roughly 60% of the forested area of the area is forested by the end of the simulations. And this reduction in forested area, coupled with warmer, drier climate, led to reduced carbon uptake by the forest compared to historical conditions. And so what we've got here are, again, the colored box plots are projected climate and wildfire. The black box plots are historical climate and wildfire. And then the bar chart on the bottom is the percent of the area of each transect that's a carbon source to the atmosphere by the end of the simulation. And so what we're basically seeing is with the reduction in forest cover, 40 to 50% of each transect being a net source of carbon to the atmosphere by the end of the simulation period. So from these two studies, what we determined in sum here is really that climate change and wildfire interacting together result in declining species richness across the mountain range, reduced tree regeneration, lower total carbon in the system, a reduction in forested area, and more of the forested area or more of the previously forested area that becomes a carbon source to the atmosphere. So what we wanted to do next was really kind of dig into the potential for forest restoration, restoring surface fire to these historically frequent fire forests, and how that might alter some of these carbon outcomes under projected climate and wildfire. So I'm going to walk through a few different studies we've been working on. One is looking at projected climate and treatments in Arizona ponderosa pine at Camp Navajo in northern Arizona. The next, we're going to go back to the Sierra Nevada, where we've got a study where we looked at extreme fire weather and treatments. And then some recent results where we've been working in that same Dinkey Creek watershed, looking at optimized treatment placement and climate and its influence on carbon dynamics. And then zooming back out to the whole Sierra to look at the influence of treatment timing and climate on carbon dynamics. So to evaluate the efficacy of restoration treatments under projected climate, I ran a series of simulations using an ensemble of projected climate data for early, mid, and late 21st century at Camp Navajo in northern Arizona. And so the early century period was projected climate data from 2010 to 2019, mid-century was 2050 to 2059, and late century was 2090 to 2099. And the reason I created distributions for those decades and drew from them throughout was to really give the system the ability to have enough time to kind of stabilize under that new climate space. And that way I could evaluate the efficacy of these treatments. And I ran two scenarios. One was a no management scenario, and the other was a scenario where I implemented an understory thinning prescription, which removed about 30% of the overstory biomass. And it was followed by prescribed burning using a 10-year fire return interval. And that was applied across the landscape. The thinning was restricted to areas that were operationally accessible and also did not have the potential for Mexican spotted owl habitat. So what I've got here is a figure of total ecosystem carbon. The dashed lines are the thinning and burning scenarios. and the solid lines are the no management scenario. The green areas are early century climate, the red or orangey color are mid-century, and the blue is late century. And then the lines are mean values from replicate simulations, and then the shaded area are the 95% confidence intervals. And so in the absence of any sort of management intervention, I found a steady decline in total ecosystem carbon over the course of the simulation period. And this result was a little bit surprising given a previous study where we had done a similar simulation experiment, but using historical climate. And it really suggests that it's the interaction of warmer, drier climate and high severity fire on this particular landscape are sufficient to transition the system to a much lower biomass state. But under the thin and burn scenario, the effects of climate are a little more apparent in that we get some separation between the different climate futures. And by late century, the effects of climate on total carbon are statistically significant between the early and late century climate projections. And so we end up with considerable more carbon in the system under the treated scenario, even though we're initially whacking the system pretty hard by removing 30% of the above ground biomass, and then we continually implement prescribed burning, which is putting carbon up into the atmosphere. So when I really dug in to these details, I wanted to look at what the total flux looked like from the system. So in this particular figure, what I've done is calculate the mean cumulative net ecosystem exchange, which is the flux of carbon between the forest and the atmosphere. And so NEE is from an atmospheric perspective, so negative numbers mean the forest is removing carbon from the atmosphere. And as these figures show, over the course of the 100-year simulation period, the thin and burn landscapes were a carbon sink, while fairly sizable fractions of the control landscapes, which are on the three figures on the top, were a source of carbon to the atmosphere. And when I ran simulations of this landscape under historical climate, there wasn't this switch from sink to source in the control landscape for such an extended period of time. So what I wanted to do was really unpack this result and look at what could be driving this response. And so part of the challenge with understanding forest recovery, especially in the context of changing climate and larger, hotter wildfires, is really the potential for these severely burned sites to get locked into a shrub-dominated condition. And so following a hot fire, species like Gambel oak and New Mexico locust resprout and grow quickly in the high light environment. And their presence and really near continuous canopy cover can very quickly support subsequent fire and preclude the reestablishment of trees in the system. And so I dug into the individual species responses at Camp Navajo, and I looked at Gambel oak biomass data. And I found support for this idea that increasing oak cover was really pushing the system toward an alternative vegetation state by making it more flammable. And so I want to point out here that these figures are actually, the y-axis scales are different, with the control having a max of 3 megagrams carbon per hectare and the thin and burn a max of 1. And so by late century, the control simulations had more than twice as much Gambel oak carbon as did the thin and burn simulations. And in the thin and burn simulations, we also see the influence of climate on this species, with late century climate mean Gambel oak carbon that's about 50% higher than early century climate. So these results are indicative of what we've captured, or indicative of the fact that we've captured the dynamics in the system that can lead to a vegetation type conversion that's driven by a combination of increasing disturbance frequency and then reinforced by warmer, drier climate. So to recap these bits, in the larger Sierra, we've got this potential for a state change with climate and wildfire over extended period of time as that climate space shifts toward warmer, drier conditions. And then the study at Camp Navajo suggests that if we restore forest structure and reintroduce surface fire, we get some level of wildfire resistance, and that those treatments have efficacy even under projected climate, and we can retain forest cover for a longer period of time. So really, though, what we want to talk about is, can we expect the same response in a more productive system? So one of the things that I was thinking about when I was looking at the Camp Navajo results is really, in a system that's much more productive, like mixed conifer in the Sierra Nevada, would we expect the same kind of response when we've got so much more moisture than we do in the Southwest? So now we're going to head back to the Sierra and talk about some work we've been doing in the Dinkey Creek watershed, which is part of the National Collaborative Landscape Forest Restoration Program. Watershed covers about a 3,000 meter elevation gradient with oak pine woodlands at the lowest elevations and subalpine forest at the highest elevations. The majority of the watershed is comprised of more frequent fire forest types, including ponderosa pine, mixed conifer, and red fir. And in this study, we ran simulations that included no management, a thin only in the frequent fire forest types, and then thinning and or burning treatments applied to forest types as a function of their departure from pre-suppression fire return interval. So in the mixed con and ponderosa pine forests, it would be thinning followed by prescribed burning. And then in the red fir forest, it was just reintroducing prescribed fire into the system. So with the simulations that included historic, I need to back up here, sorry. We also included two different fire weather distributions for our simulations. We included 30 years of RAWS data and created fire weather distributions from that, and then an extreme fire weather scenario where we used RAWS data from the rim fire. So in the simulations that included historic fire weather, we found that really the upfront removals of carbon from the system in these treated scenarios maintained above ground carbon that was below the no management scenario throughout the simulation period. And this was really driven by the fact that fire weather is has been pretty mild if we look at RAWS data across the last 30 years, and fire is pretty rare across this particular landscape. And when we've got an ignition under mild weather conditions, suppression is successful most of the time. However, when we look at work that Brandon Collins has done evaluating fire weather from different RAWS stations across the northern Sierra, we see the frequency of severe fire weather is increasing, including higher wind speeds, warmer temperatures, and lower relative humidity. And these meteorological variables are all quite influential on fire behavior once that ignition occurs, and they're also quite influential in how fire burns in the simulated environment. So as I mentioned, to account for the phenomenon of increasingly severe fire weather, we developed that second set of fire weather distribution that used MET data from the 2013 rim fire, which burned over 1,000 square kilometers in the Stanislaus National Forest and Yosemite National Park. So in this figure, what you've got is the Dinkey simulation landscape and the three different fire regions, panel A. And then each of the others panels are different fire weather attributes that go into the model. And what you see in the gray distributions are that historic fire weather, and then in the kind of yellowy color is the extreme fire weather. And I'd like to focus your attention on the lower right-hand panel, which is mean daily wind speed in kilometers per hour. And you see a big shift in increasing mean daily wind speed when we look at those rim fire data. So when we run these simulations where the only thing that differs between the historic and extreme fire weather is that fire weather distribution, we see quite an increase in variability of total ecosystem carbon. So in that, under historic fire weather conditions, we've got means and 95% confidence intervals, which are pretty tight around the means. when we add the extreme fire weather, a lot more variability between fire events, and kind of the confidence intervals get much wider. And particularly under the no management and thin only scenarios. But under the thin and burn, they do they do get a bit wider, but they're still they're considerably narrower than under no management, which suggests that by restoring forest structure and adding regular surface fire back into the system, we've added a level of stability to the above ground carbon in the system. And this is really driven by the results that we see in total ecosystem carbon is really driven by the influence of the different treatments on the distribution of fire severity types we see on the landscape. So in this figure, types fire severity classes 1 and 2 are really surface fire, 3 is kind of a mixed fire severity, and 4 and 5 have some stand replacing fire. And in the case of the thin only, on the hashed bars under extreme fire weather, we see relatively little change in the distribution of these fire severity classes across the landscape. And then when we add regular burning into the system, we see that distribution shift such that much more of the fire that's occurring is occurring with or is burning as surface fire with less tree killing fire. And the reason we see that large drop in the thin and maintenance burn relative to the thin only has to do with the fact that in the thin only, we're only entering the system once initially, and then we've got quite a bit of shrub cover increase following thinning as we alter that light environment, and the shrubs are acting as a vector for fire to move through the system. So in thinking about the carbon balance of management in the Dinkey Creek watershed, we've got these upfront carbon reductions from treatment. So we're thinning, removing carbon, reducing the carbon stock through thinning, and then we're also putting carbon into the atmosphere with regular prescribed burning. But what we see is that when we restore surface fire, we end up with more carbon in the system when extreme fire weather is more common. And so we've got more of the area that is experiencing kind of a different relationship with fire as it burns across, even under these higher wind speed, drier conditions. So, but again, what about the influence of climate change? Can we expect the same level of treatment efficacy when we include projected climate in these simulations? So what we decided to do next was run another simulation experiment where we used projected climate from 4 different models in the Dinkey Creek watershed. And those are 4 models forced by the high emissions representative concentration pathway 8.5. So that's kind of the business as usual scenario. And then in this case, what we wanted to do was really look at what potential existed for how we allocated treatments across the landscape and how that might interact to influence carbon stocks. So we designed 2 different treatment scenarios. The first we're calling the naive scenario, where areas that had a lower than 30% slope received understory thinning treatments, and everything was prescribed burn with return intervals based on historic mean fire return interval for each of the forest types. And then we've got an optimized scenario where we used the no management simulations to identify the areas with the highest probability for experiencing severe wildfire. And then we limited mechanical treatments to only those areas that had a high probability of stand replacing fire and also had slopes less than 30%. And then applied prescribed fire in the same manner as in the naive scenario. So when we looked at carbon in the system, what we've got are the naive placement map on top and the optimized on the bottom, and this just shows the amount of removals, cumulative removals over the 100-year simulation. And then we can look at the distribution of those removals under the naive in the middle and the optimized on the right. And these are in, this is basically total carbon removed in teragrams carbon, so across the whole landscape. And if you look at the prescribed fire box plots, which are blue, there's relatively little difference between both the optimized and naive. But when we look at the difference in the amount of carbon removed from thinning, there's a significant drop from about, median values somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 teragrams down to median values somewhere in the neighborhood of 145 teragrams when we optimally place treatments on the landscape as informed by high severity fire probability. And what we find when we compare the two of these, so this is the percent change in mean fire severity between the naive placement on the left and the optimized placement on the right. And the take-home message from this figure is really that we get the same amount of reduction in mean fire severity across all of our replicate simulations, whether we're treating much more land area, so thinning roughly 17,000 hectares versus thinning roughly 7,000 hectares in the optimized treatment placement. And the effects of that on total ecosystem carbon are somewhat striking when we dig into them. So what these figures are the no management on the left, the naive placement in the middle, and the optimized placement on the right. And this is actually above ground carbon, megagrams carbon per hectare. And so this is the entire distribution of all 50 replicate simulations for each scenario. And so the top line represents the maximum amount of carbon in any given time step for that simulation, regardless of which replicate it is. The bottom is the minimum value. The gray dashed line is the median value. And then the red dashed line is the lower 95% confidence interval. And so the thing I really want you to focus in on here is the distance between the median line and the lower 95% confidence interval line. And under both the naive placement and the optimized placement, they're actually quite close relative to that no management scenario. And then if we look at the area under that 95% confidence interval line, we see much less area in the naive placement than we do under the optimized, but that's because we've treated so much more of the forest area. So in the more productive Sierra Nevada system as compared to southwestern ponderosa pine, we see a lot more resilience in the system. So we've got regeneration happening and we've also the ability to regenerate under this future climate space relative to, say, the ponderosa pine system in the southwest, which is projected to get far drier and far warmer. And we also find that if we allocate our treatments optimally, so informed placement based on high severity fire risk, we can substantially reduce the amount of area thinned. We can reduce the total carbon removed from the system and achieved the same reductions in high severity wildfire risk as we can just applying treatments wherever we can operationally do that. So now I want to zoom back out to looking at the entire Sierra Nevada. And this is a simulation we've just recently finished up where we're building on some work by Malcolm North, Scott Stevens, and Brandon Collins that really looked at the pace and scale of treatment across the Sierra. And this idea that we've got a backlog of treatments, of area requiring treatment out there. And so what we wanted to do in looking at that entire mountain range under projected climate is look at different treatment rates. So what we did is apply the same thinning and burning treatments under both scenarios, and then we created the accelerated scenario where the thinning was implemented at a rate of 25% per decade, so it would end by about 2050, and then a rate of about 12% per decade, so that the thinning treatments are applied across the whole simulation period. And then after implementing thinning, it would be followed by prescribed burning on a 10 to 30 year return interval as a function of forest type. So when we evaluated the change in above ground carbon at the end of the simulation period, we found that the accelerated scenario, which is the map on the left here, ended up having many more grid cells that had a higher carbon density, so greater than 60 megagrams carbon per hectare change over that 90-year simulation period than the distributed, which also had a much higher carbon density than the no management scenario. And when we looked at the change in the distribution of fire severity between the accelerated and distributed, we saw very little difference in terms of how much of the land area was experiencing higher severity fire. So this tells us that we've got an impact of these treatments in terms of breaking up the landscape that's available to burn under high severity fire. But really the rubber meets the road in this when we contrast the accelerated and distributed, when we start looking at the things like the non-forested area and the amount of carbon emitted to the atmosphere. And so under the accelerated scenario, because we're able to impact much more of the landscape before it burns by wildfire, the median value for late century non-forested area was about 10,000 hectares lower for the accelerated scenario than it was for the distributed, and the distributed was about 40,000 hectares lower than the no management scenario. So functionally, by increasing the pace at which we apply treatments to the landscape, we can have much less of that landscape impacted by tree killing fire and maintain forest cover for a longer period of time. The other thing is we reduce early on in the simulations total carbon emissions from wildfire to the atmosphere under the accelerated treatment scenario. So in thinking about the kind of sum total of these results, it's really, if we want to understand what the best path forward is in these systems, it's thinking about feedbacks between the climate, forests, and disturbance, and how we can maintain forest cover as these landscapes become increasingly flammable. And when we think about the role of forests in moderating climate and by uptaking carbon out of the atmosphere, there are near-term costs that have to be paid in terms of both thinning, so reducing the total carbon stock, and also in terms of putting carbon in the atmosphere through restoring surface fire regimes. And if we can accomplish this, we functionally have the opportunity to ensure that we've got some functioning forest cover across these relatively large landscapes. And that information, or that fact, can be used to account for or basically slow down the rate of change under projected climate and give these systems some time to reorganize as they experience drier and warmer climate. And with that, I'd just like to acknowledge collaborators on this, Dan Krofchek, Shuang Lang, Louise Loudermilk, Rob Scheller, and Leroy Westerling. And then this work was funded from a combination of sources, USDA NIFA, Joint Fire Science Program, and the DoD's Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Wonderful. Okay. Are there any studies that are based only or predominantly on managed wildfire?
So if I'm interpreting that right, so any one of the studies we conducted, so particularly that first Dinkey Creek study where we looked at extreme fire weather, that would really suggest that we've got an opportunity to capitalize on natural ignitions when they occur under relatively benign weather conditions to have more managed wildfire in the system. So we're not looking specifically at managed wildfire, but it would be how you achieve that regular application of fire across the landscape could be from managing natural ignitions or implementing prescribed burns, if I answered that.
And feel free for the person that asked that question to type a follow-up in the chat box, and we'll get back to it if we need to. The next one's pretty easy. Are the fire severity classes that you discussed, are they based on land fire?
No, they're not. They're based on it's a calculation in the dynamic fire extension of LANDIS-II that's functionally looking at how much canopy mortality we see as a function of the rate of spread and a few other factors in the calculation.
Okay, this next one's a little long, so bear with us here. So thinking about the findings in the Dinkey Creek area and how bark beetle activity is also reduced via treatments, if you were to include bark beetle or drought impacts on forest carbon in the Dinkey results, how do you think the carbon benefits of treatment might shift?
That's a good question. So there's some work that Rob Scheller's leading in the Tahoe Basin, following on some other work that Alex Kretchen led, looking at parameterizing the model to include beetle outbreaks. And the work where we've got beetles and treatments and stuff like that all interacting, it doesn't look like we get the same kind of knock-on effects in terms of reducing beetle outbreaks, if I'm remembering the results correctly, in the Tahoe Basin, as we do from the effects of treatment on altering kind of high severity fire risk. And I see on the chat thing that Rob said that's correct, so my memory has not failed me, thankfully.
Excellent answer. Yeah, that was a good point. I know that there's a lot of areas that, even though we're out of the drought for right now, we still are dealing with the impacts. So thanks for that follow-up. The next one is, with reduced tree canopy cover, what role do meadows and native grasses play in carbon storage? So say an understory dominated by shrubs, or versus say an understory dominated by shrubs.
Yeah, so if you look at a shrubland versus a grassland, you've got a lot more carbon stored in the soil under a grassland than you do a shrubland. With shrubs, there's most of the biomass, or a good fraction of the biomass, is above ground, and thus the carbon is above ground. But either of those numbers in terms of above ground biomass pale, obviously, in comparison to the amount of carbon stored in a forest. And so it's really I think more of an ecological question than it is a carbon accounting question when we want to look at meadow restoration versus what's the outcome of meadow invasion by shrubs than it is a carbon question.
Okay, the next one, and we still got a couple, so we've got plenty of time, which is excellent. So there's a new study that's out by Kaiser and Westerling, and it reported no significant trend in high severity fire occurrence over the period of 1984 to 2014 in the western US, with the exception of Colorado. And that's consistent with other published studies that have found a lack of increasing high severity fire trend. What do you think of this finding, and how might it affect the modeling assumptions in your work?
So I'm embarrassed to say Leroy sent me that paper and I have not read it yet. It's on my to-do list. So there's some work that's been done in the Sierra in particular that showed trends of increasing fire severity, but really we're not making assumptions about increasing rates of high severity fire. That's not it's not something we parameterize in the model. So what we are parameterizing are the characteristics of the landscape. So things like carbon density or biomass density across the landscape and how it's allocated. And then when we parameterize the fire aspects, it's really fire size, ignition frequency, and things like that. And so the fire severity we see in the model is a function of the interaction of, one, does a fire occur? Two, what's the draw in terms of fire weather? So under what conditions are it burning? If it's more near extreme conditions, it's got higher wind speeds and the like. And then three, you've got the interaction of the fuels and slope in influencing how that fire burns across the fire footprint. And so I think as our results show with a more open canopy where we've dealt with the fuels and then the surface fuels through prescribed burning in the Dinkey Creek watershed, you see that reduction in the area impacted by high severity fire. And so really it's the amount of high severity fire in the no management scenario in our model simulations is really a function of characteristics on the ground and then the weather conditions that are occurring when an ignition occurs.
Excellent. The next one is, when modeling reduced forest cover, were you able to account for changes in regeneration rates due to increasing high severity patch size? So the whole idea that a bigger patch means a longer distance from a seed source.
Yeah, so that's really the driving factor in the first Sierra-wide results I showed from Shuang where the reason we saw a big drop in the number of regeneration events and also the species that were able to regenerate was really driven by the area burned, distance to seed source, and then overlaid on top of that, the climate space that's occupying that area in terms of the fire footprint. And so, one, we've got an increase in the distance, dispersal distance that the seeds have to cover in order to get there. And then two, where the mature individuals that are nearest by might not be able to regenerate in that new climate space in that fire footprint.
Okay, and the next one is the idea that when we're taking wood products out of our forests, we can then kind of store the carbon in the actual products. So do the management scenarios in your models account for differences in resulting harvested wood product pools?
No, so when we're talking about removals from the system, we just treat everything as a loss in terms of the carbon accounting. And we know from some of the work we've done at the Decadal experimental forest in the Southern Sierra, and some work that was done at Blodgett, and then also some work in Northern Arizona that roughly 60% of that harvested trees can end up in long-lived wood products. But we don't account for that because that would require a whole different set of assumptions in terms of wood markets and everything like that. So in the desire to be conservative and also remove those additional required assumptions, we just treat it as a loss from the system.
So if anything, these scenarios might actually end up with even less carbon being emitted to the atmosphere, which is great to know. The next one is, have there been any studies that have modeled changes in soil carbon changes with changes in fire return characteristics under fire suppression scenarios? So in other words, would there be a gradual change in deeper carbon pools over time?
So when we're running these simulations with the Century succession extension, we do have a soil model in there. And so we can look at changes in the soil carbon stock over time. And I can't off the top of my head, I'd have to dig back into the results to look at what that entails. But if I remember correctly, we did parse it out for a study at Fort Benning in Georgia, and we saw relatively small changes in soil carbon under the different management scenarios over kind of the life of the simulation, so over 100 years or so. I would expect that there's a few pieces of the puzzle that we're missing, and one is inputs of black carbon into the system with regular prescribed burning and the like that could alter total soil carbon. But when I presented the results on total ecosystem carbon, that is both above and below ground.
Okay, and then we have a species-specific question. So in the Dinkey Creek scenarios, how did black oaks and sugar pines?
So we've not actually the projected climate scenarios for Dinkey Creek. Those figures are kind of hot off the press, and we've not dug into the individual species responses yet. So I don't have an answer for that question.
That's all right. You had great answers for most of those. So it looks like we might be tapped out as far as questions. So I wanted to thank you not just for joining us today, but for some excellent information that I'm sure we really appreciate it. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks. Bye.